Today we have the joy to have a presentation of project Meerschaum. And we have the key developer here, which is Bennett, known by us by Meares. And he will do a quick overview over his project. Nothing else for me to say. I hand over to Bennett. Hello, Bennett.
Hey, Minimac. Thanks for that great intro. There are a lot of moving parts to this talk, but if we've played our cards right, the video should turn out well. Right, so today's presentation is an interactive one. I'll be talking for the first half hour or so, but what I really am hoping we can accomplish in today's chat is that you guys can get some experience using Meerschaum or even just data pipelines in general. After the first half hour, I'll be ready to field any questions. And then to wrap things up, I have a very brief challenge for you guys, and I'll see if you guys can accomplish that with what you've learned today. But with that said, first off, my name is Bennett. I've been working on Meerschaum for the past, I guess 9 months at this point. But the idea for Meerschaum came long before that. So I had another job where I was doing an internship as a data engineer, working with facilities data. Like think energy use, temperature, CO2, things of that nature. I did many different iterations. I wrote tons of scripts. I had, through that experience, a lot of different sort of like growing pains that most developers who work with data all share, like a collective things that we just have to deal with. So for example, one case is that we wanted to copy data from 4 or 5 legacy databases. One of them was an Oracle server that had been running nonstop for 8 years. One of them was a Microsoft SQL server, which was pretty old, had been running since 2014. And then a couple MySQL servers. And in a lot of enterprise or even small businesses, they just have an old database system that has been running forever and they don't want to touch it. And so my task was trying to tie all of these different data streams and data sources. One of the data sources was a script that would read CSV files from an inbox. Another one was it had to parse JSON from a web API. What I'm trying to get out here is data was being consumed all over the place in different formats. And it was my job to clean it up and put it in one easily parsable central place. I don't know if anyone here has run into stuff like that, but I feel like at least in data processing, it's a pretty common problem that's solved. Over about 2 years, I built 3 or so iterations and built individual systems. And when I finally left that job, I still had a lot of ideas and I wanted to see what else was possible. I started the GitHub repo and I decided, all right, I'm going to write this completely from scratch. I want it to be open source and I don't want to write code for one specific business. I want to write code that anybody can use. And so I guess I wanted to democratize the tools that I was building.
As we are still recording, so I would already have a question. So the thing is, you were in fact working for a company and you were confronted to a situation and you were realizing that all of a sudden that you needed a tool that would make your job easier. And so you said, okay, I want to program that one myself.
Exactly. But that exact situation didn't happen once or twice. It happened like 100 times. And every time I just had a central code base. Next thing I know, what started off as a collection of scripts evolved into a handy toolbox. One of my colleagues, which I believe he's listening now, referred to Meerschaum as a data engineer's toolbox. And I feel like that's a really accurate way to describe it because it doesn't do just one or two things. It's a meta system of sorts. As I get further, you'll see what I mean by that. But exactly, Minimec, I think this is pretty true in other open source projects where a developer has frustrations, decides to publish their work, and then other people can get utility out of that as well. And that's what I'm hoping to accomplish here. Also, I did notice in the chat, yes, Narb, is that your username? Has posted the project homepage. So if you want to, go ahead and get started. Check out meerschaum.io. If Meerschaum is too hard to spell, I also own mrsm.io. And in fact, before I even do anything on the terminal, I think that's a really good place to start just by browsing through the website. And so I describe what exactly Meerschaum is just on the homepage. If you work with data, you have to do all sorts of gymnastics to clean and process this data. Rather than going through that effort and solving the same problem 5, 10, 100 times. Meerschaum just makes the plumbing, you don't have to worry about the plumbing and what's actually happening. It makes your actual job of data analysis quicker and easier. The first command that I have on the Get Started guide is just run the command mrsm stack up -d. mrsm stack is a wrapper around Docker Compose. If you've ever worked with Docker Compose, all the same commands apply here. But in case you've never worked with Docker Compose, stack up will just create Docker containers and manage the different services for you. If you don't have Docker installed or you're not comfortable using Docker, it's not required for Meerschaum to work, but it does make things a lot easier, and you'll see what I mean. All right, stack up -d. The -d, it just means run as a daemon, run in the background. Alrighty, so now our Meerschaum stack is up and running. And this, I think, illustrates what even is the stack pretty well. So by default, the stack just consists of 4 different services. You got your database service. Mosquito is just an MQTT broker. We'll talk about that later. That's not entirely important right now. Grafana, which is a data visualization platform, and then the Meerschaum API. All right, so now that we have the stack is running, let's go ahead and hop inside Meerschaum. Now, when we ran the last command, I did mrsm and then some string of commands, but if you want a more interactive experience, if you just run mrsm by itself, it'll throw you inside of the Meerschaum shell, which is less like bash and more like a launcher of sorts. So first, I'll show you the command show. If you're ever unsure what you possibly can do, just preface something with help, and then it'll print the doc string there. Oh, I see a question in the Mumble chat. Do you need to add your user to the Docker group? For the stack command to work, your user needs to be in the Docker group. To get started, let's show pipes. Now, pipes are the primary metaphor. That's the whole point of what Meerschaum does. And it should say no pipes to show, which I know it's in red, but this is not an error message. This is just letting us know, look, everything's in order. You just haven't done anything yet. I've written a command called the Bootstrap command, which is, if you don't know where to start with, everything you can do with the Bootstrap command, you can do with other commands. But it's like a wizard, a setup wizard for you to help. So let's go ahead and bootstrap a pipe for us and see what actually is going to be happening here. All right, so it wants to know where we are pulling our data from. A pipe really has 3 parts to it. The first part is its connector. That is, over what protocol, how are we actually going to transfer this data? Connectors can come in all shapes and sizes. You can have a direct SQL connection, which for performance reasons, if you can do that, I recommend that. You can transfer data from another Meerschaum API. You can read from MQTT, or, and this is what I'm hoping users can really get a lot of use out of, you can build your own custom connector by writing a Meerschaum plugin. And I'll be demonstrating 2 different plugins here. But for now, let's do a new connector. So I want to do a SQL connection, but since it's not in my configuration, it's not listed here. Here's the different types we can choose. We want a SQL connector. Call it demo. It's a timescale DB one, but the process is pretty much the same regardless of what the flavor you choose is. mrsm_main is our database. mrsm.io is our host. Our password is just Meerschaum. User is Meerschaum. Super secure. Okay, 5432 is the default timescale DB. It verifies, all right, you're about to register a new connector, which it is called SQL demo. Yeah, it's worth noting, whenever I say a Meerschaum connector, it's denoted as the type of the connector, colon, the label that we gave it. So in this case, SQL demo. Sure thing. So now that we're done with the connector step, that's part 1 of what a pipe needs. Part 2 is the metric, that is to say, the label for the contents of the pipe. Let's bring in financial data. Finance.
So if I got you right, what you did right now is you connected the database and you told Meerschaum what type of database it is.
Precisely. If the database has 15 different tables that we want to sync, you only have to register the connector once. In the future, you can just refer to it as SQL demo in this case. So I have some demo financial data. The third step of what a pipe needs, it's the connector first, metric second, the location third. Now the location is optional. In most cases, you can just skip this step. It's worth noting what I mean here. So suppose you had weather data, 2 weather stations. If you create one pipe and then later you want to create like a different one for a different station, you can differentiate those two. It's another dimension you can add, but we'll skip that for now. Here's where you have to know the shape of your data. Meerschaum really needs time series data, so it has to know what your columns are going to be called. In this table that we'll be reading from, timestamp is the date time column. The ID, I think, is account number. Pipe's been registered. We have a connector. We have attributes. What I mean by editing the definition is what is the actual SQL query that we'll be executing to bring in our data. So this can be as crazy as like a super long SQL query where you do all these crazy fancy aggregations, or it could just be as simple as select all from. Simply just copying tables, that's probably the way to go. I think the name of our table is plugin_apex activities. This could be some arbitrary table name that your legacy database might have. Save that. The final step is, all right, everything is in place. Would you like to actually execute the SQL now? We'll say yes. If I get everything correct, it should work. Alrighty, now it's done. To recap, I know a lot of stuff just happened and it's easy to get buried in the details. The big 1,000-foot view of what we just did is we instructed Meerschaum, here is the metadata that you need in order to obtain data. In a case of a direct SQL connection, you have to know a whole lot of things. Like you have to know the database parameters and you have to type the SQL. At the low level, a direct SQL connection, although it's really fast, you have to make sure you get everything correct. I'll talk about more flexible ways than a direct SQL connection, but it's worth noting why we did it this way. Hopping back in Meerschaum, let's show the pipes that we have. Before, remember, it said no pipes available. Now we get some metadata for our first pipe. You'll recognize everything we typed in. Here are the connector keys, SQL demo. It's a finance pipe, no location, and then our columns and definition. To verify everything is there, we can run the command show data. By default, that just shows us the most recent 24 hours. In this case, it's the last 24 hours of the table. So it has nothing to do with today being March 28th. It's just the last records in this table are from March 26th. So this is just some simple cash transfers from an account. It doesn't actually matter what the data itself is. All Meerschaum cares about is the timestamp column and maybe an ID column if we have it. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and sync another table, another pipe, but this time we'll be doing it through a different method. To verify that we added SQL demo, here it is SQL demo. This is the metadata that we just registered when we made the first pipe. SQL demo is here. It just so happens to be that SQL demo is itself a Meerschaum instance. Now, if it's a random legacy database, you cannot do this step. If also it's another instance of Meerschaum, that gives you a little bit more flexibility in things you can do. What I mean by that is if you run the command instance, you can choose one of the connectors that you've registered, and commands that you run, it'll look to that database for the data, not just the computer that you're running on. SQL demo is the one we'll be using. Our prompt changed to let us know we are now acting as the Meerschaum user at this connector. So the command show pipes, from before it just showed us that single pipe we made. SQL demo already has in itself 3 different pipes. To verify the show data command, this is all of the data from the other tables. We're not connecting over SSH or anything like that, all being carried out over the connector itself. I can run the instance command and reset back to my default. And now the commands I run are with respect to this connector. And SQL main is the default connector, which is localhost. Okay, actually, before I get into bootstrapping the next pipe, I feel like connectors are so important that I kind of have to hammer it home. When you run the command edit config, it'll open your primary config file. It probably should look something similar on your end like this. If you're running this in production, I highly recommend you change this before running your stack. But if you've already deployed your stack, it's really easy to change your password. But further down, here is SQL demo. This is the demonstration database that we added. A direct SQL connection is not the only connection that's possible. There's also API connections and then other types at the bottom. The 3 ones here have to do with the way Meerschaum decides which connector it's going to use in which place. The instance command, which I ran to like hot swap between connectors, by default, it'll use whatever is here. In this case, SQL main. The API instance command is whenever you spin up an API server, which instance will it default to. So it is possible for your shell to use one connector and your API to use a different connector. The default repository has to do with plugins. I won't talk about that immediately, but that is important too. But don't worry about that right now. What really matters is we were able to easily add a new one, and now I'll be showing you how to sync a pipe through a different method.
Okay, we would have 2 questions. One
yes.
is for me. So if you install Meerschaum, would you say that the default configs are ready to use, or does one anyway has to edit the config file?
That's a really good question. They are ready to use in the sense that you can just install Meerschaum, run stack up, and immediately start using if you don't care about security. But if you're running this in production, I highly recommend that you have HTTPS set up on your host. So you've seen bootstrapping a SQL pipe, but let's bootstrap an API pipe. Yeah, let's go register a new one. Why not? API. Oh, sorry. This one will also be demo. It is at the host api.mearsm.io. The way the API works is you have to have a Meerschaum user account. By default, when you install and spin up Meerschaum, it disables that. I don't want you to accidentally expose yourself to allowing user registration. It's really easy if you do edit config system to allow that. I already have a user account at this server. I'll be using that here, but I'll be showing you how you can do that in a second. I don't want to get too sidetracked. It's so easy to get sidetracked when I'm talking about these things. Okay, I'm going to use the Meares user. It can work over HTTP, but I definitely recommend HTTPS at 443. Okay, looks good to me. Okay, this next one will be weather data. So I'll be using the location Clemson, because that's just the one I have where this particular server happens to be located. Okay, now we have to know the shape of the data, the names of the columns that we're dealing with here. All right, here are the columns we're dealing with. Timestamp, easy, and the ID is station. Date time will be timestamp. ID will be station. Yep. And would I like to edit the definition for this? Yes, I do. Before, when we had this question, it prompted a SQL connection. But since this is an API pipe, all it needs to know is what the keys on the API server happen to be. So this is on the remote server, because I'm connecting 2 different Meerschaum instances here. And these are the keys that we're going to be entering. So plugin :NOAA is our connector keys. Our metric key is weather. And our location key, we're going to leave it blank. And to verify, we're just copying and pasting these here. All right, same question as before. Are we ready to sync? I'm going to say yes. And it's done. So show our data to verify. And okay, that's the most recent 24 hours that we have from our remote server. Now, it just so happens in this demo, they're both coming from the same computer, but the important thing to visualize here is that they could be coming from anywhere in the world. They're different computers over different protocols with different network configurations and different usernames and passwords. Things can get really complicated really quick, and that's why the configuration settings are so important. All right, I see a question.
You said that for that API thing that you just did,
yes,
that we needed an account with MRSM.
Oh, yes.
So that was only for the concrete thing you did, but generally you don't need an account with that. You can do whatever you want.
Exactly.
It's just for the, yeah.
I should have specified, you don't need an account with mrsm.io specifically. You need an account with the Meerschaum instance individually. If you spin up your own Meerschaum instance, and we'll do that now. We'll say register users demo. The password will be demo1234. We have just created a new user for the instance that we're connected to, in this case, localhost on my laptop. SQL main. It's just like when you're connecting to another SQL server, you need a username and password. When connecting to another Meerschaum account, you also need a username and password. It's, in my opinion, very important that we separate the SQL login credentials from the Meerschaum login credentials, just for security's sake. Show pipes. When you have more than one pipe, I have this handy dandy little tree graph here. These are the 3 keys that are vital to Meerschaum: the connector, metric, location. Right now, they're just static tables. Well, really, they're hyper tables. It's the way timescale DB works, but for all you need to care about, they're just SQL tables. I'm going to show you with stack ps, just Docker compose ps. The services that are running are database and Grafana. If you go to the server you have it running on, in this case localhost, by default it's port 3000. We have a pre-configured Grafana instance. Now, before I go any further, I want to ask, is everyone here familiar with Grafana, or have you ever heard of it?
I know it for creating dashboards for different data.
We use it a lot with OpenShift. It's a very nice program for displaying time series data. Very like it.
Exactly. And I've worked with SAS. I just can't stand it. I've worked with Power BI. What it comes down to at Grafana is, it's, in my opinion, the easiest to work with, particularly with time series data. By default, when you deploy a Grafana instance, the username and password are admin, and Grafana very aggressively wants you to change that. But we'll skip that for now. That's not too important. To verify, here's localhost, in this case, my laptop. It's already pre-configured. The connection works. Although you can change the password here, I don't recommend it. I'll show you how to change the password in a second. But let's go ahead and make a dashboard. In the top left of this bottom section, we have the different SQL tables that are on the database. Pipes, plugins, and users are all Meerschaum internal things. The way pipes are represented as tables are just with underscores. So API demo weather, Clemson, is the weather data. The metric column is the station. And here are all the different metrics that we read. So let's look at the temperature. To switch pipes, it's just as easy as changing the table that we're looking at. But there's one final thing I want to talk about here before I go much further. The main command behind Meerschaum is syncing pipes. So we've already bootstrapped a pipe, and you saw it prompted us, do we want to sync? But if we want to continuously add new data, the command is sync pipes. Just running sync pipes by itself, it will select the SQL data from our SQL server, and it'll do the appropriate web requests to get it from the API server. We can specify looping, so it'll just loop to infinity. And I highly recommend playing around with this because you can do a lot of different things with syncing. Like you can asynchronously sync, which sounds like an oxymoron. You can specify how many seconds between things like that. Doing it like this, it will try to aggressively, continuously sync data. And in Grafana, once new data shows up, you can set this auto refresh. So every 5 seconds, it'll refresh the contents of the dashboard. I probably should have picked some more interesting data because this is not super interesting. Oh, and I'll round off with one more thing. The way I got this data is with Meerschaum plugins. If you run the command install plugins, the purpose of mrsm.io is where I store these plugins. Like with a Docker repository, you can have your own private plugins, but these are the public global ones that you can install. So we will install Noah and let it do its thing. And the way Meerschaum works is you'll probably see it install a lot of Python packages. It tries to install everything into its own virtual environment. So when you install plugins, and all of its dependencies will be isolated from the rest of your system. Meerschaum is designed to run without pandas if you need it, but I'll talk about that if there's any further questions. Okay, so now that we've installed the Noah plugin, let's bootstrap another pipe. We already have our connector. In this case, it's the Noah plugin. We'll call it weather data. Let's do Atlanta. I think it's timestamp and station, the same as the last weather one, because it's all coming from the same place. Okay. This is currently the attributes we're dealing with. That looks fine to me. Yes. Now, as soon as I said yes to do you want to sync, in this particular plugin, now this is the plugin talking. This isn't Meerschaum itself. So it's asking me for the station ID. I know it has to be KATL for Atlanta. Now we're done. So show data. When you run show data, it'll try to show data for every single pipe, which can be a little bit overwhelming. Show data with the location. You can specify, okay, I want to see pipes with the connector keys plugin NOAA, or I want to see pipes with the metric weather. And in this case, I want with the metric weather and the location Atlanta. And here's the most recent 24 hours that we pulled from here. So in retrospect, we have 3 different plugins. Each plugin is using a different connector. This one is a direct SQL connection. This one is by pulling from another Meerschaum API. And this third one is entirely custom. It's pulling directly from weather.gov, I think. And they're all different sources, and yet we can sync them all in a batch in one go. And with that, I think I'll wrap up the demo portions. I'd like to propose to you all a bit of a challenge, if you guys are up to the task.
It will be like the hacker games from LabLog.
Exactly. I'm not asking you guys to hack my server, but I'm asking you to read my data. I'll be giving you some connection information, a username, a password, a domain, but I want to see if you guys can set up a pipe, get it syncing. The pipes that I showed you here are actually fairly static. They don't change very often, maybe once per hour. But the pipe for the challenge changes every couple seconds. So you should definitely be able to see if the syncing process is working or not. And I'll be taking this down by the time the video comes out. So if you're watching this after the fact, this username and password probably will not be working. The demo portion is now done. I'll keep the video going in case people would like to watch the challenge part.
My question would be completely different. So you say you started with a bunch of scripts when you were working for that old company, and all of a sudden you decided to do your own thing. Mm-hmm. How did you prepare that project? I mean, what we are seeing now is a huge thing. I was not expecting a huge project like that. How did you decide to go for to work with Docker incidents like that? How did you decide to create all the stuff the way you created it with these connectors and everything? Mm-hmm. How was the structure, and what did you use? Like, did you design it on a paper, or did you use some software to design your project? How did you do that?
Well, that's a difficult question, but I'll try to answer it succinctly. It was definitely an evolution. The original system was a series of scripts, but over the course of 2 years, I had my own schema. It wasn't connector metric location for the old system. It was a different hierarchy. I've had many long conversations with my colleagues where we debate back and forth, what's the most efficient, what's the most logical way to order these things? What are we actually trying to accomplish here? There are some strengths and weaknesses to every design decision that we had to make.
You were somehow also influenced by your coworkers. So your coworkers had some inputs and told me, well, it would be nice if we had that, or mm-hmm. It would be nice if we do it the same way. Because you see, the whole structure of the thing is very complicated. To figure it out yourself, it's your workflow, mm-hmm. But it looks like that the concept of the project and the workflow has been influenced also by other people that are maybe even using it now.
Exactly. And Meerschaum is running in quote-unquote production in a couple places. What I really, really am hoping for is that as the user base grows, I can get a lot of feedback. If you guys end up using this, or you know people that do, it's all about making people's lives easier. And if Meerschaum itself is a roadblock, then what's the point of using Meerschaum? I guess is my philosophy. Yeah.
Just how to say, I'm overwhelmed by the talk and by the complexity of the whole stuff. And wow.
I should also throw out there, I didn't talk about the website much. I really want to write a lot more tutorials. Things like today's talk. Like, I've already done the bootstrapping tutorial. I have a pretty comprehensive guide in case you want to write your own plugins. I'll be having just a generic wiki talking about concepts, handy little graphs. I am curious what you guys are thinking right now.
What comes to mind is, if you do some tutorials, what I see now, that what you did in the example, that you were able, in fact, to get some database data from publicly available databases. Mm-hmm. And if you do some tutorials, include these, because a lot of people that want to play around with Meerschaum, mm-hmm. they lack of databases, or mm-hmm. they don't want to use their running databases, so they want other data. And so having access to the weather database of NOAA or something like that is really cool.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. It goes both ways. It's consumption. it's pulling data from an existing database, but it also has to do with if you're producing your own data, you can push data with Meerschaum. I have a much more comprehensive guide on the actual Python package itself. If you're comfortable with Python, you can integrate this into your existing scripts. For example, if you create a pipe object, you can read your own data, say with pandas, or just make a dictionary, and then you call pipe.sync.
Yeah, we have many data sources across a very wide geographic area that we want to pull little pieces of data from that happen every couple of minutes or sometimes every couple of seconds, and then aggregate all of this to a dashboard that regular humans can see, because we have lots of different groups of data scientists trying to get at various points of data throughout the entire system.
That's exactly the use case that I'm trying to reach. Thanks for your input.
And well,
I really hope
you
can
got
use
it. See if I can get it done in parallel with all my other jobs, right?
My goal is not to make your job harder, but quite the opposite, in fact.
Oh, no. Because I learned this, and I can show this to our data scientists and say, here how to use it. It's already like pandas. It ties into pandas because they know much about panda. And here how you can, grab some Microsoft SQL data and mix it in and grab some Oracle. Oh my gosh, Oracle data, don't get me started. But this is a tool to pull this all together and then put it in Grafana, and then we can serve it up on our OpenShift and etc.
So if you're familiar with Grafana, you know Grafana has its own ingestion system. You can add connectors and data sources. However, that it's sort of like executing views, and it can put a ton of stress on production machines. And that was one of the headaches I had at my job, is that the facilities guys said, here's a login. If you break our machine, you'll lose your job. And so I had to build a system to materialize the cache. And so Meerschaum does something of the same sense, where it takes advantage of timescale DB. Well, it's like this. If I'm a data engineer and I know some best practices, I can make a pre-built, fairly well comprehensive system. The defaults will work just fine. If you really want to dig into it, you certainly can. If you don't have the time of day to care about changing things, just leave it the way it is.
Could we feed this into a horizontally scaled InfluxDB to then fuel the Prometheus and Grafana? Is that a possibility for use of this?
Now, unfortunately, at this current time, I don't have any compatibility with InfluxDB, specifically because it's a NoSQL server, and I'm old school. NoSQL scares me a little bit. But I 100% agree, and I have been thinking a lot about particularly Prometheus and system management, like monitoring of that nature. If there's a need for it, I'll implement it. Currently, no. But if you think you need it, I'll work on it.
So, curious, what is the data store? I missed this. Did you say it?
It's timescale DB. But just know timescale DB is the default choice that I've implemented into Meerschaum. If you already have a backend, like MySQL or something, Meerschaum, it's pretty agnostic about your backend. So if you're deploying this and you're trying to connect to an Oracle backend, I cannot guarantee it will work, but it should work. When you run into problems, please open issues on the GitHub. What I showed in this talk was what I imagine users will do, people who are not developers, but they have to interact with moving data around. And that was like my bosses at my old company. They were just old school engineers who did not know any programming languages. Maybe MATLAB, but is MATLAB a programming language? Okay, I just. But they had to deal with databases on a daily basis. A lot of my job was making tools that they knew how to use. I've said everything I need to say. What I really want to hear is, does anybody have that Grafana dashboard up and running?
I don't know how to run what SQL command to run.
Oh, you can just use select all from table. Select star from table. Plug in since weather.
So I guess PyCrash is on the way to win the challenge. Where can people reach you? So give us your website. And do you have any social media accounts where people can reach you?
Primarily, you can reach me at GitHub. My username is bmeares, just like here. The website is meerschaum.io, mrsm.io. I have a link to my LinkedIn in case recruiters come across Meerschaum. Primarily, if you want to get in contact with me, go ahead and open a message or start a discussion on GitHub, and I'll be sure to answer it there.
And obviously, the easiest way to reach you is to assist to the Lovelock sessions on Sundays, because you have become a frequent listener and participant to that.
I have. I was a bit of a lurker for the first 6 months, but now I'm here.
And we're happy to have you. And again, also, people can reach you on Elements, meaning Matrix, also under the nick Meares, right?
That's right. I want to say thanks to Minimech for having me, because I sheepishly asked if I could maybe sort of present Meerschaum one day. You quite surprisingly were very receptive, so I want to say thanks, Minimech.
You don't have to thank me. It's an open room. The Lovelock sessions are open for everyone. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we hope to still have you here in the future, right?
Oh yeah, of course. I'll be here next Sunday.
Are there any questions in the Lovelock of all the people?
Go ahead.
Philosophical questions, if that's all right.
Let's go for it.
Sweet. This has been a really cool demo. I actually opened Meerschaum bug number 1, complaining about not having enough documentation. So this was excellent documentation.
Oh, Casey, you're that Casey.
Sure am. The extract, transformation, load steps that we've kind of seen here today, do you envision that like Meerschaum stands as sort of like a permanent syncing service type thing? And if so, what do you think like your bottlenecks in this stack are in terms of like ability to handle large quantities of data?
I am so glad you asked that question, because that is the Achilles heel of Meerschaum. Of course, I try to talk as positively as I can, but trade-offs have to be made. It can handle several million rows at a time. I've done some benchmarking tests where I'm trying to push the limits. Okay, I'll put it this way. So Microsoft SQL Server has a linked server option where you can directly connect Microsoft SQL databases. And that's like the most efficient way to connect between those two servers. But that comes at the expense of not having compatibility with Oracle or MySQL or whatever the case may be. I want Meerschaum to be this great equalizer. I don't care where your data comes from. I mean, yeah, the syncing service, like you said, is a huge part of Meerschaum. For a senior project of mine, I'm installing this on Raspberry Pis, and I'm making like a distributed hierarchy. I want data producers and data consumers, clients and servers, to both be able to get use out of Meerschaum. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I'm trying to sort of get a feel for like, at what point do you think a Meerschaum stack should be converted into like a bespoke custom syncing service? Do you think that there's a particular point where it's more useful to go build something a little more traditional for doing data sync? I'm very specifically trying to get at, it seems like it's good for like, I have a quick sync that I want to do. Mm-hmm. You did mention that it's running in production in a few locations. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of digging at like, how much data would those locations have to scale to before Meerschaum started to fall behind real time?
It handles a ton of small pipes a lot better than a few really large ones. If you're going to have a huge throughput, I recommend fragmenting, having 3, 4, 5, 6 different Meerschaum installs, maybe like one per warehouse. And you could have a central one if you wanted to compare across warehouses. Meerschaum can definitely scale up to these large demands if you're willing to tweak it. It's a toolbox. I don't want to sell it entirely as a prepackaged solution. For these small demos, like a quick sync you had mentioned, it's perfect for that. But if you really want to scale up to that ability, then Meerschaum is an aid, not the solution.
Got it. Thank you.